Hey everyone, welcome to the Overcommitted Podcast, the number one podcast in the world according to our moms. We discuss code commits, our personal commits, and some stuff in between. I'm your host, Jonathan Tamsut, joined by...
I'm Brittany Ellich.
Hey, I'm Bethany.
And I'm Erika.
We are software engineers who initially met as a new hire group at GitHub and found a common interest in continuous learning and building interesting projects. We continue to meet and share our learning experiences and discuss our lives as developers. Whether you're pushing code or taking on new challenges, we're happy you're listening. Today's episode focuses on AI 2027, a scenario prediction published by a nonprofit called the AI Futures Project. Our goal today is just to discuss the document and talk about the progress of AI and, our fears and sort of predictions for it. So as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about a article that was published, I think earlier this year, called AI 2027. Before we begin, I just want to kind of summarize it. As I mentioned before, it was published by a nonprofit research group called the AI Futures Project. It was the people who published it were former employees at OpenAI. There's also someone who has experience forecasting, and they make some pretty bold predictions. So we'll throw a link to the article in the show notes. But basically, the gist of it is that they believe that we're going to, or I guess they predict with some probability that there's just going to be a takeoff in AI progress. And I think what's cool about this article is they actually walk you through it sort of step by step. So kind of the key ingredients that they think are important here are, we're gonna scale AI compute, and so we'll talk about sort of the role of compute in these models. And they believe that the way we're going to get to this sort of artificial superintelligence ASI is through training AI models that act as AI researchers. So there's this sort of recursive self-improvement that occurs. There's some wargaming in this article. So they talk a lot about an AI arms race with China. So, the United States and China are going to be in this report are going to be competing to develop artificial superintelligence. That's sort of not too surprising, considering I think AI could definitely be used as an instrument of war. One other, I think, interesting thing about this is they break down AI progress into sort of two parts. One is compute, so just getting bigger computers, training bigger models. And then they also talk about sort of algorithmic improvements. So how can sort of the underlying algorithms improve the performance of these models? So we'll talk a little bit about, I'm sure we'll mention the history of sort of algorithmic improvements and stuff like that. And they also, another huge sort of strain or topic in this article is alignment. We'll talk about that. But, how do you get an AI to share our values? And there's two endings, and I won't, maybe we'll spoil them later, but there's two endings of the slowdown and the race. And basically they sort of describe two different scenarios, one in which we kind of slow down our AI progress and focus on safety. The second in which we kind of carry on and try to outcompete China and develop a super intelligence that may or may not. So with that, hopefully that gives you a little taste of what we're going to talk about. Very lighthearted, fun topics today. So I guess I'll start off. Was there anything that stood out to you guys in this article that you found particularly interesting? Or anything that when you were reading, your kind of mind was blown that you hadn't really thought about before?
I think personally, it was interesting them coming at it at an angle of these agents or models are training themselves, and they're really coming at it from that perspective of a researcher and making the ideal researcher. And then through those parameters, these models that are training could have differing goals from future models or from the humans that are behind it. So I did think that was an interesting prediction or strategy that AI research might take. One thing I did notice was they mentioned AI models generating content to train other models on, which I feel like is just a big in AI training. I was interesting that they were kind of a little blasé about it, given the expertise in the group that wrote this, but maybe I missed something around that.
Yeah, I think I'm always very skeptical of any future predictions. But I did find this a valuable read for understanding some of the potential risks. This is kind of like a worst case scenario. They do give, they say the predictions that we make have been supported by research and, they're not coming out of nowhere. Like they're all possible, but it's a very aggressive timeline. And it's also like dependent on a lot of things happening. I think the most important takeaway of this for me is, well, two things. One, how important it is for like regulation in the AI space. Like a lot of the worst case outcomes here, specifically around the like AI intentionally misleading or having nefarious, which apparently is already shown to be happening in some models. Like that was described as something that's an outcome of prioritizing speed of development over safety. So kind of what you were saying, Bethany, like adopting some of these like not so great practices, and like maybe they wouldn't do that, but like there's nothing stopping somebody else from doing that. Yeah, I mean, you can train your model however you want these days. You can pull data from really anywhere, and who's going to stop you? And what's to say, like, you have to prove, you know, how you got that data, or like what the training or what the intent is. So, I mean, honestly, like, I kind of think that like the AI industry needs to be regulated to a similar degree of financial industry, where you have to be able to prove every transaction, prove every, like, you know, every inference, maybe not like to that exact degree, but like, you know, I want to see the intent, I want to see the inputs, I want to see the like thinking, because yeah, I think this is something that could happen if we don't if we take steps now to ensure that we're developing this safely. I think the exciting part is like, wow, this stuff is actually possible. This is super cool on a theoretical level if you have this doing the right things, like, you know, these sort of like, they call it like geniuses in a data center. Like, how cool is that to like have that brain power if it's doing the right thing? But yeah, it's also like super important to regulate it and like make sure that it's progressing in the right direction and that we're like valuing the right things as we go along. And then one more thing, sort of like on the exciting part, like it also got me thinking of like, you know, this idea of like, oh, is AI going to take my job? Which I think we're going to talk about a little bit more later. But, you know, they kind of describe like, yes, there will be job loss of in the software engineer world, like writing the actual code, but we'll become more like managers of agents. And like, I was like, well, it's like a little bit sad because I do like writing code, but mostly I want to be involved in the process and I want to be like building things and like building cool things. And I don't think that part's going to go away. So yeah, I'm trying to adopt that sort of like mindset shift of like, okay, it's okay if like, you know, what I'm physically doing in my job is different as long as the outcome is still the same. So kind of coming to terms with that.
I had a lot of thoughts reading this as well. I feel like this could be like a 4-hour long podcast episode of us talking about this. There's so much. But just briefly, the things that I think are the most interesting from reading this is the idea that we're going to be training models that will train the next generation of models. I don't know if this is, I'm not an AI researcher. I don't know if this is already how things work, where you train a model and that model is used to train the next level of models. But it seems like it's somewhat of an inevitability that eventually we will get to a point where we are building models that are smarter than humans, and indeed smarter than like even the smartest of smart humans, which is really interesting. But I also think that there's a lot of hubris associating all of these human traits with these models that we don't have the capability to understand. Like there's this big understanding that they're going to be just as selfish and like self-interested as humans. And so they're going to want to try to, you know, break down the entire world to build paper clips or whatever it is that they've been given as a goal. And I'm curious, I think that is, you know, I think that's a big assumption that it's worth ascribing, because we don't know what they're going to do. Obviously, this is a future prediction, but I think that, you know, we're saying that they're going to be very human-like, and I don't know that we can necessarily say that for sure.
I think those are really, really interesting points. And it got me thinking that like the idea of goals, initially when I heard about this paper, I was like, I cannot envision a computer system having goals or having like the desire to go after something. But I do think like to kind of call out to our podcast about thinking in systems, like it is a system. So a system will have goals, whether that's something that is explicitly like wanted by the individuals within the system or like is given to the system. I think that's kind of where the nuance comes from. But it is a really interesting way of looking at this prediction and paper. But I think really interesting thoughts on the paper as a whole.
And I'm to kind of respond to what all of you said. I mean, I think I think one interesting point that was made is like training these models is like training a dog, right? I think they drew that analogy because like you're kind of looking at the output behavior, but you don't truly know what it's thinking. And they introduced this term called like mechanistic interpretability, right? And so this is something we don't currently have, and like no one knows how to do this. So this is the idea of like, can you go into these models and understand them truly, like from a step-by-step point? And like that's like an unsolved research problem, which is pretty scary because we talk about these models becoming smart, potentially smarter than us, and they can lie and they can manipulate, and that's pretty terrifying. I think, the fact that these models have goals is just, I think it's like sort of a kind of a deep mystery in the field, right? You have these transformer, these models are based off this like neural network architecture called transformers that do like next token prediction. And that's sort of the loss that they're trained on. And like from that emergent property, you get these goals and this sort of like deeper understanding. So I think that's like really interesting. I'm like, frankly, just pretty pessimistic about if this, I think, in this article, I think a big unknown is like, there has to be like pretty significant technological advances in order for these agents. I mean, at least, a lot of the research at these research labs at like OpenAI and Anthropic is like, is not public for safety and, competition reasons. But it does feel like we're far away from this. I mean, obviously this article claims that this is all going to be around in 2027. So I guess, who knows? But there does seem to be a little bit of like technological hand waving. The other thing I do want to mention, and we'll post it in the show notes, is one thing that this is sort of predicated on is there's a paper published in 2020 by some OpenAI researchers about scaling laws, and basically there's this like observation that the training loss, so basically like the model performance, just improves the more parameters these models have. So basically these models get better the bigger they are. And people think that this is going to go on indefinitely. There's no reason to believe that this won't stop. And so there's this kind of idea in the field that's talked about, it's talked about in this paper and talked about elsewhere, that like we actually have the knowledge to build artificial superintelligence now. We just need to get bigger models, which is interesting, and we'll see. And I think that's sort of been disproven a little bit with chain of thought, but that's sort of an interesting idea here.
Yeah, I guess the other thought that I have related to what you said is like these technologies only have as much power as we allow them. Like it's similar to like, allowing human power or human intervention. So like giving someone access, elevating them to a place of power or leadership, that needs to be something that we agree on and that we allow. But like once you do, you have to deal with whatever the consequences are. So like we're sort of in this transition period of like crazy growth within the AI industry, and we're sort of like giving it access to everything. Like I think of like MCP, which is super cool, but like also it's very permissive and like not really locked down at all. So some of this stuff like, oh yeah, giving it access to, a system or a network or something, like, yeah, if you kind of like carte blanche, give it access to everything, okay, then you have to deal with the consequences. But again, like if you take maybe a more conservative approach or, like give it access to a more limited scope, or take a sort of more skeptical approach of like, okay, well, I know that it has this potential, but like, I want to like think through the consequences and potential implications of like using it in this maybe potentially like high risk scenario. Like, yeah, I think that we need to also like think through that. But it's, in my mind, it's not really any different than like electing somebody to a political position or like elevating someone to a position of power within a company. Like you're giving them power, and like that's a choice. And yeah, so like, but like you can also take it away, and not saying you're going to be in the same place you were before you did that, but Like there are actions, corrective actions you can take on the back end if you end up making a mistake too.
Mm.
And I think a lot of that assumes like people purposely putting AI into various experiences. So like knowingly setting up MCP servers or whatnot. I think there is something to be said too, though, about, I mean, even prior to AI, there's computer worms that will like infect your network, infect your devices and stuff. And they're not intelligent at all, but they can spread like nothing else. And so if you add some intelligence to that, I wonder if that adds complexity to the situation as well and makes it harder to reverse.
Yeah, that's very true. Like, I feel like with any technological development, you have to think of what will happen if this gets into the hands of bad actors.
Yeah. And to your point, one question I think I do have, and, I think this is like, no one knows the answer to this, is like, is this reversible? I mean, if there's sort of this sentient, superhuman system that is far smarter than any human, can coordinate with sort of infinite clones of itself, like, who's in charge at that point? If this has goals that are distinct from human goals, like, if this is out in the wild, maybe, it has some type of physical embodiment. It's in a robot. I mean, it's like, well, at that point, I don't know if humans will be able to be like, okay, AI, like go back into the data center. It might be like, no, I don't want to. So I think that is scary, hopefully far-fetched. But I mean, this paper is terrifying. This paper is absolutely terrifying. I don't know if you guys felt terrified reading this, but it's pretty scary.
Okay, I do think that there's an aspect of it that is very scary, for sure. Especially if you take it at face value and you're like, these things are potentially going to happen. But I mean, you could write that about anything. There could be Yellowstone could blow up tomorrow, and you could write an equally fear-mongering paper about that. Not that I'm saying that this is just fear-mongering, but there are a couple of things in the paper that give me a little bit of pause. Like, for example, the discussion about the political implications on the slowdown side, where they say, oh, whoever is vice president in 2027 is automatically going to be elected to president in 2028 because of their impact on AI. I'm like, okay, we already know who this person is. This was released 2 months ago. We know who like this elephant in the room vice president is. We know this person already has a lot of ties to like large tech companies. And it makes me, I tried to Google like, okay, who is funding AI Future Project? Like, is there something else going on here to where somebody might be trying to put this out there into the world as some sort of like political maneuvering stunt as well?
Did you find anything?
No, I couldn't find anything worthwhile. I think it looks like it's mostly funded by Google, but yeah, TBD. But I feel like that in particular gave me a little bit of pause where I'm like, okay, who is trying to scare everybody into thinking that the government is going to need to step into AI?
I should note JD Vance did publicly claim he read this paper, though.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it is, the political aspect of it is pretty fascinating, right? Because, I mean, this is such a powerful technology, will become nationalized. It has it'll, I mean, if it sort of bears out in any way that is similar to what's outlined in this paper, it'll have just profound implications to, our society. I mean, I think even like when you think about software, I don't even know. I mean, if this pans out, I don't even know if software will exist in its like current form. Like maybe we won't have user interfaces. It'll just be like we'll have like an agent that can, book us flights and do everything we do sort of, kind of manually. Yeah. So it's pretty.
Yeah. The other thing that I thought was interesting was how the average person's life was described through this, and how, most people are still going to be using AI for entertainment. There's going to be some sort of UBI situation because, I mean, there would have to be something, I guess, if there's nobody that's working. Maybe not necessarily. I think there was also a mention that like the Dow would be at 1 million, which just to me screams of like hyperinflation and like major economic problems. But yeah, I think one thing that was mentioned was like, yeah, you'll be able to create like a AAA game with agents in a month or something like that, that's like highly customized to you and all this stuff. And like, it sounds like the idea is that like people, I guess, are just going to be entertained by AI and by like all of the technology, and we'll just be chilling, not working, which is also kind of an odd perspective.
Sounds like someone watched WALL-E.
Yeah, I know. And like, I feel like a little bit of that aspect is misunderstanding how humans work fundamentally. I really have a hard time believing that like we as humans will operate fundamentally differently. I do believe that there's like more potential unlocked by AI. Like I see this as like, you know, sort of logical next step of like electronic technology from the internet. Right? News consumption as a single, you know, viewpoint, right? Like 50 years ago versus today, there's so much more news that you can consume on a second by second basis. And like AI, it's kind of a silly like application of that, but like, yes, like AI may unlock even more potential for like more information, more content. But like at the end of the day, how much news can one person consume? Like we are still a limiting factor of like, I can only read so much. I can only take in so much information. And like, I also just really have a hard time believing that we can all sit around and be idle, and be happy and functioning. Like, I truly believe that like we need to be like working. I don't know if that means like we all turn into gardeners or what. Like, I don't know. Like maybe we all find something more like close to the earth that we do as opposed to like working on technology. Yeah, I really don't I don't believe that that's going to happen. Yeah, and I kind of feel like the claims that will happen are sort of misunderstanding how humans work fundamentally.
I think it's basically every software engineer's dream that they want to go like live in the woods though and like start a farm. So maybe this is finally going to become a reality for some people. I think the news aspect is a very good point though that you bring up. Like we already know that the media can manipulate people, and when we have AI controlling the media, like it can control a narrative and control the way that people act. And so like you think you can just unplug it, but if AI is also controlling the perspective people have of AI, then we wouldn't.
Yeah, and I think that's I mean, all of this has been happening for years just due to social media and like various algorithms posing different or like skewing viewpoints and such. So I don't think this is necessarily anything new. It's just more automated. So I guess it makes it easier to do.
And
Yeah, and like,
well,
oh, sorry.
Bethany, to your point, I read Sam Altman wrote an article that came out on his blog, and he said we already have a great example of a misaligned AI. That's your social media algorithm, right? It is meant to engage viewers and get people upset.
Yeah,
That's so true.
well, and like with the news aspect too, like I'm already very distrustful of like human-based news reporters, and like I take a very critical eye to like any claims or any arguments or any opinions, and like I basically don't put any credence in like AI generated news as much as I can spot it or whatever. So like, yeah, I mean, I don't know how many people are the same and how many people are that critical, and not to say that I can't be duped or fooled. I'm sure I'm absolutely fallible, but I'm also like very distrustful of the technology, and I don't think that unless, like you said, there's some major shift in transparency, that will ever change for me either. Like, it can do amazing things, but until I can ask it and believe like, what it says when it's telling me where it got this information or why it thinks the way that it does, then like I'm going to be inherently skeptical of the output.
One comment there, and then I swear we can move on. But one thing that I think is interesting is there's also been this shift recently in the last couple years towards video. Like everybody wants to see video. Like even when we were starting this podcast, we were doing some research and everybody's like, everybody wants a video podcast. So I wonder if that part of that is because of that like authenticity you get from seeing like actual people talking. And that's part of like, people don't want to just read something or listen to something because that's easier to fake than video. Not like you can't fake video, but I'm curious if like, looking for that authenticity has some sort of impact there too.
I also think one kind of disheartening thing, at least in the short term, is like, business leaders are already sort of eager to replace humans with AI. And like, this is something like, Mark Zuckerberg claimed that 33 or something % of code at Facebook is going to be written by AI. If this does sort of pan out I think there's certainly going to be a period of like, this awkward period, hopefully a short awkward period of like upheaval where, capitalists are using this superhuman labor. Human labor is obsolete, at least in totally or partially. And we need to figure out like, well, what, how do we align our species, our society to sort of, give everyone, the ability to live a, fulfilled life and meet their basic material needs. So it is going to be interesting to see how this pans out. I'm not super encouraged by sort of the speed at which government adapts to changes. And I hope there's not going to be a lot of pain and unrest.
Yeah, well, and that is also a point that's not captured in this article or not article, but the report, the summary is the factor of like corporate greed and corporate interests. It's only really mentioned as like a slowdown aspect of like, oh, well, like corporations might not be able to adapt to the speed of AI research. It's like, okay, no, but there's also a side of it where like currently we're seeing, like you said, a lot of tech leaders, a lot of corporations stoke the fire and hype this up for the sake of sales or shareholder values, or do layoffs because they, claim that this is proof of the speed and the progress of AI. And yeah, they didn't talk about that at all in this, but at least currently it's a major factor in the speed and the growth and the progress.
Yeah. And we've already seen it. I mean, right? There's Waymos driving in Los Angeles that are taking jobs away from Ubers. And so, I don't know at what point the government is going to have to step in. Maybe they'll have to be 10% unemployment or whatever. I mean, this is, potentially going to be a massive upheaval that, I hope policymakers are watching, and I hope we can sort of navigate.
Yeah, I kind of think of the FDA in terms of regulation. At some point in history, people were just making drugs and giving them out until there was a regulatory board to say, okay, you have to go through this specific process to make medicine, and it has to pass these tests and have to be like validated by this board and things like that. I almost wonder if tech is going to go through something similar where more and more technology is vetted through regulatory agencies and things like that. So I think it is an interesting point we're at with really not much oversight from the government. And that's helped made a ton of progress, but also at what cost? So I think it's a really interesting period, and it'll be interesting to see how this kind of causes ripples throughout history and technology to come.
Yeah.
I'm pretty skeptical that the government is going to be capable of keeping up with things just based on what we've seen so far. We already have so much evidence about how harmful things like social media are to like the mental health of children, just as like an example. Like there's so much evidence that supports that it is really, really bad for kids' mental health. And I mean, you still have people doing basically nothing about it. And so I think that this is a very interesting topic. I've heard like the idea floated around a little bit about like a code of ethics for like software technologists. And I think that would be more successful than relying on the government to step in. Like, I think that there is a really fantastic opportunity here for people who build software to come together and regulate ourselves in some sort of meaningful way, kind of like, like doctors have like the Hippocratic Oath that they have to meet. I feel like that's not necessarily more likely, but probably going to be more successful than relying on the government for regulation because it just moves too slow.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And like, you also have to think of like the motivations. Like, okay, why has there not been any social media policy enforced? Like, we've seen Mark Zuckerberg on the steps of the Capitol. We've seen lobbyists. They're putting money into this to prevent it. Like, until that stops, or until, somebody steps in with more money to fund the opposite side, like, it's not going to happen. Yeah, I think you're right that, like, we've seen great success in, like, open source communities. It always blows my mind that there's some of these, like, amazing groups within technology that, that sort of, like, self-form, to enforce certain standards on their own. And I think you're right. I think that's a probably better place to put our focus, because otherwise we're probably going to be kind of shouting into the void and hoping on something that's like not going to happen. Because for both reasons, like you said. Like, on the one hand, a lot of these like legislative bodies don't even know how to regulate these technologies. And that's not to say that it's an easy question to answer. Like, it's also hard for me to even say, like, what would regulation look like outside of sort of some of those transparency aspects. But yeah, I think like the researchers themselves or like the technology community are going to have a better idea of that. And also like, yeah, like it sounds a little altruistic, but like probably have purer motivations outside of whatever's motivating Washington these days, like, which is probably money and lobbying and power and self-interest. So I wouldn't necessarily, it sounds very like sort of skeptical and of me, but like I wouldn't necessarily think that anybody would be motivated to do that, but we've seen it in other aspects of technology, especially like web technology. So I do believe that it's possible.
I don't know if you guys sometimes I like going on YouTube and watching like mashups of like these tech CEOs at congressional hearings and seeing Congress people ask them totally nonsensical questions. It's really funny. And then you kind of just see their response. It's also like maybe, I think it is heartening and I think it is a good thing that there are multiple companies doing this, right? I mean, if this was just Google, so hopefully these companies can kind of counterbalance one another in some way. But I guess sort of the converse to that is now they're sort of incentivized to compete with one another and race towards market dominance, which may have them deprioritize safety. Okay, well, I think it's time for our fun segment. And I thought for our fun segment, we can all go around and we can talk about our PDoom. So PDoom is a term in AI safety that refers to the probability of existentially catastrophic outcomes as a result of artificial intelligence. So basically, what is the probability of AI basically killing us all? So it's a number between 0 and 1. There's actually a website, we can link it in the show notes, with sort of famous AI researchers listing their PDoom. So you can provide a number or you can provide a range and maybe an explanation. I can start. This is totally not super well informed, but I'll say my PDoom is between 0.15 and 0.25. I think maybe, I think it's possible we're in a hype cycle and there's going to be difficulties employing this technology. I think that's probably, until I'm proven wrong, where I stand. But definitely if these sort of technological advances come to fruition, that's pretty scary.
Sorry, I thought you said from 0 to 1.
Yes. So from 0 to 1. So I said 0.25.
Oh, got it. Okay. My brain was filling in the numbers wrong. From 0 to 1. Yeah, I haven't thought about this very much, but I think I'd probably land around like 0.2. Yeah, like I think it's possible, but I think that there's a lot of mitigating factors and I don't necessarily think it's likely.
I'm going to say for me, it's probably like more like 0.01. Like we've survived this long. I'm not confident that AI is going to be our downfall. Call me a hater. I don't know. I like never say never, which is why I would say 0.01, but I highly doubt this is going to be our downfall. But yeah, hopefully the world does not prove me wrong there.
Yeah, I would say I'm probably at about a 0.05 to 0.1. Maybe a little bit less confident than Bethany, but I think it's gonna evolve and there's the possibility that it'll go crazy, but that's also, assuming that we aren't able to make changes along the way if we see things heading that direction. And I feel pretty strongly that humans want to continue living. So just like as a collective species, typically. So I think that if something big does come up, then we'll prevent it. I think it's also important to say that one of the guys that wrote this article, his PDoom is 0.7, which is also good perspective under which you read the entire thing.
I think we can guess which outcome he chose to in the reading.
Yeah, I'm also curious what
I hope he's
podcast you Brittany was saying that she listened to some podcast interviews and stuff like that with the authors, and I'd be curious. Maybe you can link those out too to hear some of those and find out more of their perspective.
Yeah, I'll share the next big idea podcast. And I'm also going to share in the show notes the Apple paper that just recently came out. We could probably do another talk about that because I've heard it's sort of like a counterpoint to this that's a little bit more not balanced necessarily, but the different viewpoint of, I think it's called The Illusion of Thinking. So I'll share that as well.
I read that paper yesterday and I have a lot of thoughts on it. Yeah, I think that would be an interesting idea. I mean, there's kind of the question of like, do these models actually reason? Have like generalizable reasoning skills, and there's kind of controversy there. But yeah, pretty fascinating stuff. Thank you all for great discussion. It's always nice to hear your perspectives, and I appreciate that. So without further ado, I thank you, listener, for tuning in to Overcommitted. If you like what you hear, please do follow, subscribe, or do whatever it is you like to do on the podcast app of your choice. Check us out on Blue Sky and share with your friends. Until next week, bye-bye.